Vítám vás tady všechny na naší první panelové diskuzi, kterou považuji za velice důležitou, protože to je panelová diskuze o faktech o porodu doma, čili klíčové téma této konference. A věřím, že se nám podaří shromáždit všechna fakta pro argumentaci buď pro nebo proti, pro rozhodování maminek, jakou cestu zvolit, pro postoj porodních asistentek, jak to udělat, kterým směrem se dát, zdali se bát, anebo se nebát porodu doma. A na to, abychom si mohli udělat ten dobrý obrázek, tak tady máme naše milé panelisty. Ještě nám chybí paní Zuzana Candigliota, která prý jede z parlamentu, takže se k nám přidá časem. A já bych chtěla přivítat Kenneth Jonese. Je to výzkumník, epidemiolog, kanadský spolupracovník porodních asistentek, který má otevřené srdce pro porodní asistentky a drahý přítel. Dále tady máme paní Judy Cohen. Judy Cohen je úžasná porodní bába, není na to lepší slovo, to se nedá jinak říct, energický člověk a výzkumník taky, a tak bude s náma hovořit o porodech doma. Dalším panelistou je paní Christine McCourt. Paní Christine McCourt je vyučující porodních asistentek, profesorka porodní asistence a zároveň výzkumnicí a byla jedním z vedoucích pracovníků, organizátorů, výzkumníků velmi známé studie Birthplace, čili místo porodu, která vyšla v roce 2011, byla publikovaná. Takže se budeme těšit na její zkušenosti a znalosti. A pak tady máme paní Jette Aaroe Clausen. A Jette Aaroe Clausen je porodní asistentka, profesorka porodní asistence a výzkumník také v oblasti normálních porodů. Takže máme samé přímo špičkové diskutující a já se jich tedy začnu ptát na to, co nevíme, protože se dohadujeme a tak dále. Doufám, že se vám diskuze bude líbit. Budeme postupovat tak, že vždycky položím otázku a v podstatě všichni panelisté na ní budou odpovídat. A moje první otázka je, existuje v zemi, z které pocházíte, sledování počtu porodů nějakou oficiální institucí? Víte přesně, kolik porodů doma probíhá ve vaší zemi? Můžete od Jette ke Kennovi nebo zpátky?
In Denmark, we are monitoring home birth. It has been done for years. Approximately 1.4% of Danish women give birth at home, and it is rising. We know that for the women who give birth at home, that the results are good. But we have some problem with our statistics with the women who would want to give birth at home, but who are having complications during pregnancy. We do not have good statistics on that, and the health department is working on that. So we have some issues with our statistics.
So you cannot tell us what way, omlouvám se, nemůžete nám říci, jakým způsobem jsou ty porody v domácím prostředí monitorovány. Jestli je na to nějaký zvláštní systém.
Zuzana, what do you mean by how are they monitored?
Jestli existuje třeba nějaká speciální statistika, speciální formuláře.
Yes, home birth midwives they will have to. They have a sheet with a lot of questions about complications and outcomes that they will have to monitor, and they will send this sheet to the health department, because we know that it is so important that we can distinguish between unplanned home birth and planned home birth, and we can't do that.
Takže to je prováděno, tato statistika.
So in that respect you can say that we have a system. But you know, in our normal healthcare system, it is electronic. But the home birth records is still in writing, so they go to the health department and they will put in the numbers.
A to hlášení je povinné.
And we hope within a few years that it will become electronic like everything else in the healthcare system. That would be appropriate.
A to hlášení je povinné. The reports are obligatory.
Absolutely.
Every midwife must. Každá porodní asistentka musí.
In Denmark, we have a system where actually our whole system with social security is built on that midwife report birth. So midwives are the central person in giving people social security numbers. Mm-hmm. So if a midwife don't make a birth certificate, that would be very bad practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Děkuji. Mm-hmm. Jak je to ve Velké Británii?
Okay, in Britain the data have improved. It still could be better. We had good records for where a baby's born, but until recently we didn't have good records for the planned place of birth. At the beginning of the birthplace study, we requested changes in the routine data forms to include planned place of birth, and that was implemented, but we don't think the data are good enough quality yet. We weren't able to do our larger study using routine data because the records weren't kept well enough. We do have other good sources of information about intervention rates and outcomes and so on from a voluntary group, the website Birth Choice. But planned place of birth is the crux to being able to do further research using routine data.
A porodní asistentky jsou povinny hlásit, jestli asistují u porodu doma a jakým způsobem?
Well, almost all our births are in the national health system, but all midwives, even the independent midwives, have to keep detailed records of the birth. So all the data are there. The issue is more that you know, not every word in an individual set of case notes is recorded on the computer system. So what we've tried to do is to get the planned place of birth onto the computer system. So it's always there in the records. It's being able to access it. But midwives absolutely have to keep very detailed records of everything.
Jak je to v Izraeli?
I understand in Czech Republic you have about 100,000 births a year. In Israel, our country is about 1/10 of the size of your country, and we have 150,000 births per year. Of them, 700 are at home. And how do we know this? Because one doctor who does home births decided 10 years ago he wanted to write up the outcomes. And so he started in 2003, completely privately, emailing all the midwives to send them at the end of every year to fill in for each birth what he felt was important, birth weight, and whether there was a transfer. So it's completely private. And because of his collecting the statistics, we don't know, I didn't lie on any of mine, but we don't know if midwives lie or not, because they have every reason to lie, because in Israel taxes are 50 or 60%. So if you declare a birth, and the births are quite expensive, 5,000 shekels, it's about 1,000 euros. So then you have to pay half of that in taxes. So there's good reasons to lie in case they come for you for taxes. But he is the best we have, and he published halfway the outcomes. After 10 years, he had 5,500 home births with no perinatal deaths, and he stopped. This year we had our first perinatal death of a baby born at home. I think because the midwife was somewhat new and didn't know well to do resuscitation. She called the ambulance and the baby died 12 hours later. So it's more like the Czech situation, that it's not accepted, it's a fringe behavior, it's paid for by the woman having a birth privately, which has pluses and minuses. It gives the midwife complete freedom.
Judy, já se omlouvám, k tomu se ještě dostaneme, takže přerušuji, ale rozumím tomu dobře tak, že není 100% monitoring porodů doma v Izraeli. Že odhadované číslo se jenom tuší.
There's no monitoring whatsoever, and once I was involved in a court situation and I went to the ministry. People after birth bring a piece of paper from a doctor that they gave birth or from the midwife, and I wanted to know if the Ministry of Health talked to the Ministry of the Interior, so if they could know who did births, and the Ministry of the Interior said no. We have no obligation and we will never give our information to the Ministry of Health. So there's no official record of home birth, whether it's attended or unattended.
Děkuji. A ještě máme 2 země, ještě máme Kanadu a Českou republiku. Takže jak je to v Kanadě?
Thank you, Zuzana. In Canada, first of all, we have provincial responsibility for health, so each of the 10 provinces does something slightly differently. That's just Canadian. But in the largest province, Ontario, the midwives have to explicitly provide detailed information on every birth they do, and of course that includes explicitly where the planned place of birth was. It varies by province, but it's called the Born system, and all births require this detailed reporting. And the study I reported from Ontario was just based on those routine records. They just took the routine records that had that level of detail and did the analysis based on that.
Děkuji. A co Česká republika? Sluchátka. Tak, Český.
Tak v České republice by samozřejmě porodní asistentky měly rovněž vyplňovat formuláře a hlásit narození dítěte a porod, ale samozřejmě, že za situace, kdy zároveň český stát brání poskytování péče u porodu doma a zastrašuje porodní asistentky od poskytování této péče, tak řada z nich to nedělá. Neboť řada z nich ani nemá oficiálně oprávnění k poskytování té péče. Tudíž kdyby ty údaje hlásili tak, jak mají popravdě, tak by se vystavovali tomu riziku, že je začnou úředníci stíhat pro přestupek při nejmenším. Takže máme, pokud vím, tak sbírá data jednak statistický úřad a jednak, teď nevím, jak se jmenuje ten druhý úřad, Ústav zdravotnických informací, a oba ty úřady mají trochu jiné údaje, protože mají jiný způsob vyhodnocování a získávání těch dat, ale to, co je důležité, je, že v České republice rozhodně nemáme žádný objektivní sběr dat a už vůbec ne ohledně plánovaných domácích porodů, abychom mohli vyhodnocovat bezpečnost této péče.
Děkuji. Takže je možné říci, že v podstatě až na výjimky státy úplně přesně nevědí, kolik porodů doma proběhne, a je teda těžké říci, jestli jsou úplně bezpečné nebo nejsou bezpečné, ale k tomu se ještě dostaneme později. Nyní bych se chtěla zeptat na takovou otázku, kdo poskytuje péči během porodu v domácím prostředí. Je to lékař, je to porodní asistentka, je to gynekolog, nebo jsou to takzvané tradiční porodní asistentky, které nemají vzdělání porodní asistentky úplně, jako třeba v Jižní Americe, jestli se nepletu.
From a Danish perspective, it is really easy to answer this question because only midwives provide care in the home. It's in Denmark we have a tradition that the midwife is a very respected profession, and in our legislation it is stated that the midwife has an independent scope of practice. That means that uncomplicated births that are within the framework of 37 weeks and 42 weeks with a baby head down, birth position, only one baby and no complications, the midwife can take care of these births without asking any doctor for permission. She can also go to a pharmacy and buy the drugs that she needs. For instance, syntocinon for treatment of postpartum hemorrhage, or vitamin K for the baby. Home birth is in a Danish setting not very controversial. It's actually, we only have 1.4%, but we don't argue about it anymore, or at least very, very little. And actually 2 years ago, the head of the obstetrical organization in Denmark said in a radio broadcast, well, you know, home birth is safe, I think, but you can't expect me to ask my daughter to give birth at home. And it was kind of a little of a turning point, like kind of we had this feeling that it has become less controversial, and this kind of statement kind of highlighted that. So midwives do the birth at home, but in a very close relationship with local hospitals. And do you want me to say a little about this, Zuzana?
Maybe, když tak později.
Later. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Stejná otázka pro Anglii.
The situation in Britain is quite similar to Denmark. As I said before, births outside the national health system are very, very few, only about 1%. The health system is integrated, so midwives have a similar autonomous scope of practice for women who don't have medical complications. Midwives attend home births. There's usually a second midwife who's called later in the first stage of labour to support the primary midwife. The actual arrangements for the attendance vary across the country quite widely, with some areas having organised home birth teams, some areas having caseload practices where they follow the women through from early pregnancy to postnatal, and some areas really aren't very organised. They simply have community midwives who may be called for the home birth. Way back, we had a system where GPs supported midwives at home, kind of going back to the 1950s, but now it's quite rare for medical professionals to be involved in a home birth.
Tady porodní asistentka, hlavní poskytovatel péče. Děkuji. A Izrael?
My situation is nothing like England or Belgium.
Denmark.
And I think Denmark. And I think that I have a lot to offer in information, because where Israel was 10 years ago is about, I think, where you are now. When 10 years ago home birth was 1 in 1,000, and now it's 1 in 500. And if you keep publicizing, you'll reach there. And now I'll say that there's good and bad points to all of this. For example, 10 years ago, I could get order Pitocin from the pharmacy and Methergin, no problem. And then 2 years ago, they said, no, we can't. You have no access to Pitocin. So the only way I can have Pitocin is if I have a friend who works in hospital and she steals it. And that was okay for a while, but now the Pitocin you cannot steal anymore. And Methergin, until 2 months ago, I could order it at the pharmacy, and now the country made a new rule that you have to pay quite a sum to register every year for the right to order Methergin, and it's a bureaucratic process which actually is impossible. So these are not bad things, these are just facts for midwives to know. One of my reactions when Zuzana invited me was, no, don't bring attention to home birth. Just do it. Just tell women to do it. But don't make any, because what happened was this doctor who collected statistics, he published them, and it went into the newspaper that the home births had risen 100% from 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 500. And then that's when the government starts to make more and more regulations against it. But
Judy, sorry.
That's it.
I would like to give the word to...
Who provides the care? We have 15 midwives, 4 obstetricians, and no doctors doing home birth.
Když jsem říkala doktor, tak jsem myslela rodinný lékař. A takže porodníci ano a domácí lékaři ne.
No family doctors. You know, obstetricians, one obstetrician he didn't succeed in finishing his internship because of the cruelty he was seeing, but we call him an obstetrician.
Děkuji. Co Kanada?
In Canada, again, we have different things going on in different provinces. However, about 90% of Canadian women have the right access to midwifery, and midwives, particularly in the larger provinces, have a responsibility to provide care where the woman chooses. Obstetricians and medical doctors could do home births. I'm not aware of any that currently do, but they could if they wanted to. And particularly in Ontario, the largest province, where the most midwives are, about 700 of the 1,250 midwives in Canada are in Ontario. In the Ontario system, the midwives have to do home births and they have to do hospital births. They have hospital privileges as primary care providers for low-risk women, and they have to do at least 10% home births so that they can provide proper choice of birthplace to women. Now, the 3 tenets of Ontario midwifery are continuity of care, i.e. care with the same provider through pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. Informed choice, so that the woman makes the decisions based on being properly informed. And choice of birthplace. So in theory, up to 90% of women in Canada could choose home birth and have it paid for through our universal, not-for-profit healthcare system.
Otázka další. It will be another question about this. Dorozumím tomu dobře.
That must mean put on my headphones, yes.
Rozumím tomu dobře, že porodní asistentky jsou povinné chodit k porodům doma občas, aby si udrželi dobrou zručnost a povědomí?
Absolutely.
To je krásné, děkuji. A jak je to v České republice?
Tak u nás je to přesně naopak, protože u nás oficiálně podle názoru úřadů nikdo nesmí poskytovat zdravotní péči u porodu doma. A to z toho důvodu, že nemá nezbytné vybavení, a to je porodní sál, samozřejmě anesteziolog, pediatr, neonatolog a všechen další personál a technické vybavení. Takže to je ten oficiální názor. Takže podle toho, jak to vidí ministerstvo a úřady, tak k porodu doma může v České republice chodit pouze dula, protože to je nezdravotnický pracovník. V praxi tedy je to tak, že k domácím porodům chodí skutečně duly a některé tedy porodní asistentky, ale s tím, že se vystavují riziku stíhání a státní represi. Co se týče lékařů, tak ti by teoreticky k porodu chodit mohli, ale jejich odborné společnosti a Česká lékařská komora vydala oficiální stanovisko, že poskytování péče o porodu doma je postupem non lege artis. Tudíž ti by se zase vystavovali i riziku, že by je stíhala vlastní komora. No, to je asi vše.
Děkuju. To je úžasné, když se podíváme na ten svět, jak je rozdílný přístup. Tak v Kanadě musí porodní asistentky chodit k porodům doma, aby si udrželi erudici. Naoproti tomu v České republice nebo v Izraeli nesmí chodit k porodům doma, tak jak si udrží tu erudici? No dobře, to budeme řešit některý příští kongres třeba. Tak, moje další otázka je velmi aktuální, hlavně řekla bych ze strany maminek bych ji položila. Jakým způsobem je porod doma hrazen? Musí si to ženy platit sami? Pamatuje na ně stát a podpoří je tím, že jim hradí péči? Existuje systém zdravotního pojištění? Jak je ošetřena tato otázka úhrady práce při porodu doma?
Denmark has a tax-paid healthcare system, and home birth is explicitly mentioned in the healthcare law, and it states that all regions, we have 5 regions in Denmark, are obliged to provide home birth services. And we are very, very lucky that it is in the healthcare law, because that had helped us that every time when hospitals are doing cut-downs, they have not been able to stop home birth services because it is they just have to do it. So women can ask hospitals for home birth services, and it is the regions are organizing it differently. The regions with the least home birth services, so to say, they will just send a midwife from the hospital team to the home. And a Danish midwife cannot say no to go to she has a duty to go to a laboring woman. Of course, the hospitals will try to send the midwives out that feels most confident. Then there are, in some other regions, they have hospitals has home birth teams. Like for instance, they have a team of 4 or 6 midwives that do all the home births for that hospital, and women who opt for home birth will go to them for antenatal care. But that is still within the hospital system. Then our very best home birth service is lying in the region of north of Copenhagen called Vestjylland, and there the region has made a deal with a group of 8 private home birth midwives who do, in a way you can say that the women pay the midwives, but they have the money back immediately. Mm-hmm. So it's just on paper that they pay. Mm-hmm.
Čili
not in real life.
Dostanou náhradu od státu, když to vezmeme všeobecně.
Absolutely.
Ano. Jak je to v Anglii?
Okay.
The same question for you.
Yeah, okay. If a woman wants to have an independent midwife, she can choose to pay, and some women do have private health insurance, but this, as I've already said, is not the norm, so that would be about 1% of people. The National Health Service is a universal coverage, and it's not dependent on being in work or having an insurance scheme. Everybody has the right to health care, and in the case of emergency care, which covers childbirth care and antenatal care, that right is extended to people who don't have the normal access rights for more routine care. So a refugee or somebody who is in Britain but doesn't have full residence rights still has free access to maternity care. I just wanted to say something else about Canada, because those of you that don't know the Canadian situation may not realise that the situation in Canada was very different not very long ago. One of my former PhD students...
Omlouvám se, přeruším, protože máme experta z Kanady, takže necháme Kanadu mluvit za Kanadu.
Oh no, I'm very interested to find out about the history.
Aha.
Okay. One of my PhD students and some of my master's students were involved in establishing the legality of midwifery in Canada. And we're talking about the 1990s, it wasn't so very long ago. And the provinces, as Kenneth knows, have progressed at different rates. The last time I went to Canada, Newfoundland still didn't actually have legalised midwifery. So I just wanted to say that because actually Canada shows what you can do, as well as the wonderful example we had from Brazil earlier. It is actually possible to change things if you have the right combination of activities.
Děkuji, je to pravda. A Judy, co Izrael? Jak jsou tam maminky šťastné? Platí jim stát péči u porodu doma?
So every medical problem is covered. We have 100% socialized care, but not home birth. All home birth is paid for by the mother. And keep in mind, it's even worse because each mother is paid for a first birth a gift of 10,000 crowns when she delivered. And after that, it used to be 10,000 crowns for every birth, and then we had some economic problems 5-6 years ago, and so for second births and on, it's much less, but for twins, it's 80,000 crowns in the hospital. So a woman having a home birth is not only losing the gift of money, but she's also paying out of pocket.
Tak doufejme, že tam se nedostaneme. I said hope we don't get there.
In Canada, as Christine mentioned, home births only started coming, there weren't home birth midwives in general across Canada other than in outposts that were British trained nurse midwives until the late 1970s and early 1980s. Midwives started practicing, and at the time in most of Canada, midwifery was simply illegal. It wasn't legal, it wasn't illegal. So it was a gray area in between, so midwives could practice generally unprosecuted. Those midwives and the women who used their services pushed hard through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s to get midwifery legalized. And in Ontario in 1993, I think it was proclaimed and started in 1994. Originally there were 75 midwives practicing. They were grandmothered in because they had been practicing before it was legal. There are now in Ontario, then they set up 3 schools in Ontario, and now there are 700 or 800 midwives, so over 700 midwives practicing in Ontario. So in 20 years that's increased, and midwives are taking care of more than 10% of births in Ontario, and at that time it was much less than 1% probably. And it is, as I mentioned earlier, it's universal health care. It's just automatic that of course you can have a midwife if you can get one.
A to znamená, že to platí stát.
Absolutely.
A Česká republika?
Tak u nás péče u porodu doma hrazená není za předpokladu, že by si žena nechtěla přivolat záchranku, protože nechat ji asistovat u sebe doma. A to bych asi nedoporučila s ohledem na jeden náš případ, kdy ta záchranka potom jednala docela nevhodně, když byla přivolána po porodu, aby ošetřila dítě. Ještě bych dodala to, že není hrazen porod doma u nás, tak je to spíš taková praxe, protože zákon říká, že mezi hrazené služby patří určité služby a tam je právě i péče, která má sloužit k zachování zdraví a tak dále. A je tam taková definice hrazené péče, která samozřejmě dopadá i na porody doma. Ale potom existuje podzákonný předpis, vyhláška, která stanoví ty výkony, které jsou hrazené, a tam je jenom nemocniční porod. Ale z hlediska práva toto je protiústavní stav, protože podle ústavy může omezit právo na bezplatnou péči pouze zákonný předpis, nikoliv podzákonný. A tady vlastně máme stav, kdy ten zákon podle těch zákonných definic umožňuje hrazení porodu doma, ale omezuje to až ta vyhláška. A právě uvažuji o tom, že využiju některý případ, abych zažalovala pojišťovnu.
Dobře. A nyní se dostáváme k takové otázce, která třeba Českou republiku docela pálí. Existují ve vaší zemi pevné standardy, které by říkaly, jak se má pečovat o ženu při porodu doma, aby to bylo bezpečné, jakou péči má dostat, kdo tam má být, jaké léky použít. Zkrátka mohou mít jak ženy, tak porodní asistentky nějaké vodítko, jakou minimální, tedy, nebo standardní péči by měly ty ženy dostat a co by porodní asistentky měly udělat, zařídit, čím být vybaveny.
The only national guidelines we have is only talking about antenatal care, and it says that women should be informed about the possibility of home birth. It also says that a woman should have a midwife present when she is having contraction, and it basically says that she should have equipment such as syntocinon, vitamin K, and what is it called? Ambulance. No, not Antonox, oxygen with her. But our guidelines for home birth are very limited, and I think it is historically, because in some ways it's like, women who has normal birth can deliver at home. That is basically that. And so if it is, like I said, it is the birth that is within the midwife's independent scope of practice, that is at term, born by a baby with head down. Mm-hmm. But then we have one legal paper, a guidance is it called, and in that it states that if a midwife is at a woman and complication arises, and this woman will not go to hospital, then the midwife is obliged to stay and do her best. Mm. So you cannot force a woman to hospital, and this is very important, because that means that, for instance, I heard recently about a woman in a part of the country who wanted to give birth at home in a breech position. And from the legal perspective, a midwife cannot take on that duty, because then she would not work within her scope of practice. But on the other hand, she had this obligation that if she is called, she needs to go. So what the midwife did was to go to the hospital and go to the health authority and say, okay, I'm a private midwife, what do I do now? And actually the health authority said, well, you are the midwife in our region with the most experience of birth, so we will ask you to go. So she was kind of handed over that task to attend to this birth. And I have also in another situation used this legislation to try to make place for a woman, and this was also a woman with a breech who came to antenatal care with me, and she said, I want to give birth at home. And I could tell her, well, you have these rights to have a midwife present, but I'll make it short. But sorry, I can't say that you can get a happy midwife, and because the problem with breech birth is if you are very nervous, they can get you into trouble. But this woman kind of insisted, so I went to the hospital and said, within some time we can expect this breech birth. And they got really angry with me, really angry. And some of my colleagues said, well, if she hadn't gone to such a hippie, we would kind of had made her understand that she should go to hospital. And I kind of said, well, I'm not employed in the police force, you know. And so we started negotiating, and I could hear how angry they were and that they were not feeling confident going there. So I was kind of getting really nervous for this woman. What would she get herself into? So one day I asked her, now tell me again, why is it that it is so extremely important for you to have a home birth? And she said, yeah, it's because I know if I go to the hospital, they will not honor my wishes, and I will get syntocinon, I will get pain relief, I will get fetal monitoring and things like that. And I don't know why I said it, but I said, okay, if I can assure you this will not happen, will you go there? And she said yes, and I thought, I got a problem. Really big problem. Yeah. So I went to the hospital and said to the doctors in charge there, now listen, you can cooperate with me, and then you will not have to send a midwife there. They asked me, can we admit her into psychiatric care? No. And it turned out, but the good thing is, actually, she ended up having a breech birth in the hospital, a standing breech, no fetal monitoring, no syntocinon, in the dark, with an obstetrician sitting on the floor, very happy. Not so.
Gratulujem.
Yeah, but what I want to say to you is, the reason why I could do this was just because we had this legislation saying that women has a right to a midwife, you know, that the midwife cannot say I won't go. If that legislation had not happened, I could never have made this negotiation with these obstetricians. So here a home birth mother was also doing something very good for the hospital, because in the time after this birth, actually more women had standing breeches.
Já se omlouvám, ale protože čas běží a ještě máme další panelisty, posunem se. Takže standardy ve Velké Británii. Nice guidelines.
Okay, yes. Again, we have a lot of similarities with Denmark. I should clarify that our legal situation is very similar. There isn't a clear legal obligation to provide a home birth service, but every midwife has an absolute obligation to attend the woman if she calls her at home. That means that the services have a de facto obligation. And of course this is backed up by our national policies and guidelines. We have the NICE guidelines. They're evidence-based as far as is feasible. They're not perfect, but they're very useful. We don't have a specific guideline for, as Jette said, we don't have a specific guideline for home birth because normally it would be lower risk women who are offered a choice. And so the low risk guidelines for all women apply regardless of where they're having their baby. So the care, their needs are similar, so this is the NICE approach, so the guidelines are similar. The situation, as Jette has explained, that because of that right, there are some high-risk women who give birth at home. And for us, with the birthplace study, it was quite interesting because if you set up a midwifery unit, you can create eligibility guidelines, who can come in. That doesn't apply to home. So we have more high-risk women at home than in midwifery units, and that's about women's autonomy. We are doing an analysis, just by the by, of the outcomes of the high-risk women from birthplace, which will be published soon, I hope, and it'll be quite interesting. But as Jette said, with good relationships with the midwives concerned, then there can be a dialogue about the woman's wishes and needs and the professionals' concerns. And typically, if a midwife in Britain is asked to attend a high-risk woman at home, usually it's planned because the woman says, no, I choose to have the baby at home, often for the same reasons, because she wants to have a VBAC, not have an automatic cesarean or some other issue like this. Then we do have procedures. So the midwife always reports to the supervisor of midwives, discusses the case with the supervisor. This provides expert advice and also kind of backing security for the midwife. And also we have a system of consultant midwives in Britain. These are senior clinical practice leaders, and it's typical that the midwife concerned will call the consultant midwife, and in some areas the consultant midwife will actually go on call for high-risk women who are planning to have their baby at home. So they have somebody with a kind of higher level of authority and attendance. And reports from the consultant midwives in these cases show that where you have women have rights and you have good dialogue, then they tend to make very sensible decisions.
Ale je hezké, že stát pamatuje i na ženy, které nejsou zcela fyziologické. Je hezké, že stát pamatuje i na ženy, které nejsou zcela fyziologické. A je proto určení v zákoně. Tak jako v Dánsku. A Izrael, jak je to s Izraelem? Nějaké směrnice, asi tuším, jaká bude odpověď. Protože Izrael je natolik podobný České republice.
So until 2008, there were no guidelines for home birth from the Ministry of Health. Until 2008, there were no guidelines because it was a very, let's say, 1 in 1,000 or less births. And then, as this doctor documented that the number of home births had doubled from 300 a year to 700 a year. So in 2008, they made guidelines. Some of them are normal, head down, 37 to 42 weeks. The woman has to be 30 minutes from a hospital, which is really meaningless, right? Like 30 minutes with no traffic. In what kind of vehicle, where, you know, and some of them are easy to get around, such as the baby can, if there's an ultrasound that the baby is 4,000 grams, 4 kilos or more, then you can't have a home birth. So don't do an ultrasound. And if the baby is GBS, if the mother's GBS positive, then you can't have a home birth. So don't do a culture. So we have policies, and since 2008, and I think they also have a policy that the birth cannot be in the midwife's home. And that's because 2 doctors and a midwife have birthing centers behind their house. And so that's illegal, but of course nobody's enforcing that. And I think I will take 2 more minutes. I think you're all interested. I think Jette's description is very important, even though it's a bit of a long story, because in my country, we have the exact same situation. The woman is breech, the baby's breech, and she wants a home birth. But in my country, because the midwife is less legal and less power, much less legal, so then it's up to the mother. So the mother goes to the hospital up north. I mean, it's a tiny country, so everything's within an hour. And she goes to the hospital and they say, well, of course, we're going to do a cesarean. So she leaves. And she calls her friend. It's a tiny country. She says, where can I get a doctor who will deliver me vaginally in this situation? And she calls everyone, because everyone knows everyone. And in the end, she went to the hospital and didn't get monitoring and didn't get a cesarean and had it how she wanted to, but it is up to the woman, not the midwife. And I just delivered her second baby because even though she got what she wanted, she hated the experience because it was a struggle for her. So,
Takže předáme slovo do Kanady. Jak to je se standardy v Kanadě? Směrnicemi.
Zuzana, first I want to just go back to an earlier question that I didn't answer completely. I said that obstetricians, doctors, and midwives could provide care at home. And I overlooked that actually it's a fairly new law that epidemiologists that are evidence-based are also allowed to provide home birth care.
As photographers.
As photographers. I just want to clarify that. I don't want anyone to not understand.
To bylo opravdu důležité. It was very important. Thank you.
Okay, my pleasure. In Canada, they have a complete set of guidelines in Ontario, and most of the other provinces follow those follow the lead of Ontario. They have complete guidelines for appropriate care, and they're largely evidence-based, as Christine says, as much as possible. There are guidelines for when you consult, when a midwife would consult with other midwives, when they need to consult with an obstetrician, when they should transfer care to an obstetrician, and when it's appropriate to have a home birth or not have a home birth. However, as in Denmark and in Britain, if a woman has the informed choice, and so she can decide what she will do. And for example, very recently there was a young indigenous native woman who had 3 or 4 births before at home, in water births. She now has had a twin pregnancy, and she wanted to have a home water birth. The midwives, of course, were a little anxious about that. Not so much because the birth might not go well, but the trouble they would get in later from the hospital. She did have that birth last week. It all worked out fine. The midwives were relieved, but they will not be prosecuted for providing that care because they are following a basic tenet of midwifery in Canada.
Well, and they did all their work.
And they did a lot of consulting and prep.
Takže
just one last point. In Ontario, they also have, at the Association of Ontario Midwives, they have someone who is the risk management person. Mm-hmm. So anytime you get in one of these situations where it's not quite clear what to do or how to deal with it, then you phone this person who's hired explicitly for that, a very senior midwife with lots of experience, who understands the laws, the legal system, and you consult with them, and they often provide sage advice on what people have done before, or what might be done, or how you might frame things or cover things to make sure you've covered everything up. Mm-hmm. And as an epidemiologist who delivers babies, I have used that risk management on a number of occasions.
Díky. Držet se standardu je tedy důležité. A ještě Česká republika?
Tak u nás samozřejmě žádné oficiální standardy nejsou, ale bohužel to pak vede k situaci, kdy ženy před porodními asistentkami zatajují nějaké problémy, které měly v předchozích těhotenstvích a nějaké důležité části anamnézy, a to proto, aby je porodní asistentka neodmítla. Takže u nás nejenže teda nejsou žádná oficiální doporučení, ale i kdyby byla snaha se jí nějakými řídit, tak ty ženy to budou zamlčovat. Právě proto, aby si zajistili nějak tu péči. Ale z hlediska odpovědnosti porodní asistentky lze jedině doporučit, aby si nechali od té ženy podepsat anamnézu, aby byl důkaz o tom, co jim ta žena řekla, a aby tu ženu informovali o tom, pro jaké jsou podmínky pro to, aby ten porod byl bezpečný. A mělo by to být písemně, aby to ta porodní asistentka v zájmu své ochrany měla. Je to rozhodnutí té ženy samozřejmě, ona si zvolí, jestli bude rodit doma, ale mělo by být průkazné, že dostala poučení od porodní asistentky a nejlépe s odkazem na nějaké zahraniční standardy, když už my tedy žádné nemáme.
Ale mají je ve Velké Británii, v Dánsku, i v Izraeli. Porodní asistentka musí přijít k porodu, to je podstatné, a Kanada. Takže se máme na koho odkazovat a to je dobré. A Zuzka zmínila bezpečnost. Padlo slovo bezpečnost. A protože vy všichni jste výzkumníci, tak se zeptám a poprosím o rychlou odpověď, abychom mohli dát také divákům slovo. Existují studie, které by prokázaly, a teď pozor, že porod doma je nebezpečný? Existuje taková studie, která by jednoznačně řekla, porod doma je riziko, je to hazard, nedělejte to. Kdokoliv.
Well, you can always find studies saying anything. So it's very important to distinguish between good research and bad research. And the best studies on home birth, they are very reassuring. You know, if you are a healthy woman, it is the risk, the absolute risk of, for instance, perinatal mortality is very low. And the overall is also that that the amount of interventions is less for women who give birth at home compared to if a similar group of women give birth in the hospital. But as we have some of the researchers here who has gone into some of the details, I'll leave it to them to follow it up.
Je to zvláštní, že hned první odpověď nás odvedla od je to nebezpečné k tomu, že výzkum říká, že je to bezpečné. Tak jaký je názor dalších výzkumníků? Co ty studie říkají? Je to bezpečné nebo nebezpečné?
Kenneth has done meta-analysis, so I'll let him comment on that, and I'll just talk about the Birthplace in England study, which I was involved in. So for those of you who weren't in the presentation, I'll just repeat the key points really. This was a very large prospective cohort study that controlled for planned place of birth and also the level of risk and circumstances of the women within the context of an integrated national health system with universal midwifery coverage. The low-risk women in the study were just under 65,000. The analysis shows, the primary analysis shows that there are no differences in the significant differences in the adverse outcomes for babies between any setting, and in our case that is home, obstetric unit, alongside midwife unit, which is based in a hospital, and a freestanding outside a hospital midwife unit. The outcomes for the mothers are also important. You know, people tend to talk about the safety for the babies, and sometimes they set the safety for the babies against the safety for the mothers, and it's been pointed out that this is legally speaking problematic and ethically speaking, but we found that the outcomes for the mothers were highly significantly more optimal, most optimal in the freestanding midwifery units. And following this home birth and alongside midwifery units, the rates of caesarean section and other interventions are lower. And for freestanding midwifery units, the rates of serious maternal morbidity, such as need for blood transfusion or higher dependency care for the mother, are reduced.
We're used to going in order. I'm not a statistician, I'm a midwife, and I have to answer to constant, isn't home birth dangerous? I mean, actually, let me start again. For 20 years, I would think people were asking, is home birth dangerous? And then it took me 20 years, I'm only a midwife 30 years, took me the first 20, to realize they're not asking. So now when people say, but what if something happens? I say, are you telling me or are you asking me? And 99% they say, oh, I know home birth's dangerous. I'm not asking. And I say, oh, well, I'm glad you have a license. You're a licensed midwife or doctor, so surely you've studied this very deeply. But 99% of people say, oh yeah, I know. But for the 1 or half a person who was interested, I spent all these years trying to answer, what is this thing that makes hospital birth safer? And I found that, yes, the risk of cord prolapse, and which I presented, but for some of you weren't there, is the only thing. And I prevent that by not doing vaginal exams, which causes the membranes to rupture, and by not breaking the water, even though it is tempting, and I'm a human being, and every once in a while I am at a birth and I think, boy, if I could just break those membranes, she would deliver already. And I don't, because it's a very rare thing that could happen that could make a bad outcome. And the bottom line that I would want you all to walk out of here being able to repeat is that if all of you deliver, people who have enough protein and enough vegetables and a good parsley 3 times a week and fish 3 times a week, if you deliver alone, locked in the closet, 998 out of 1,000, your baby will be fine. And if you start to bleed heavily, you can call an ambulance. And if there's any message you have to take home from this conference is, birth is not dangerous.
Děkuji. To byl důležitý vzkaz, opravdu. Budeme si to všichni pamatovat. Ale Ken je významný výzkumník, epidemiolog a určitě má spoustu studií v rukávu, aby nám mohl říct, jestli je ten porod nebezpečný z vědeckého hlediska. Judy je praktik. Judy je praktický člověk, ale na Kena se obracím jako na opravdu výzkumného člověka a je to nebezpečné nebo ne? Co říkají výzkumy?
The studies of home birth safety are on a continuum in terms of quality. At one end is the study that Christine was involved with, the birthplace study in Britain, which is probably the highest quality study that has been done. At the other end are studies that use birth certificates and don't even know, A, whether the birth was planned at home, or B, whether there was any kind of skilled attendant at the birth. My assessment of the literature, it isn't a formal meta-analysis, but from working and having done a large home birth study and have been involved for the last 25 years in home birth research and as a practicing epidemiologist with the federal government in Canada for 3 decades, my assessment is that there are 6 studies that are in the highest quality category that compare with the one that Christine has been involved with. Not as, I think theirs is the best, but in terms of being in the highest level and the highest quality means the least likely, as an epidemiologist, the least likely to mislead you as to what the truth is or what's actually going on. When you summarize those 6 studies, as I did this morning in my talk with Betty Ann, those studies give no indication that there's an increased risk associated with home birth when you have a trained care provider. And those studies were all done, well, not all of them, not in the US, most of them were done in places that have formal recognized midwifery practice. So it applies for there for sure. However, the California study was done maybe over 20 years ago, and they did not have in the US, they do not have a formalized coordinated system or universal health care, all the things you might want, and still they did fine. And that does speak a bit to the point that...
Use the mic.
I have to add something. Now remember, I'm an academic, but I'm a midwife. I'm all blood and guts. So the Grunebaum and Chervenak from New York Hospital just published this month yet another study saying home birth is very dangerous. And I just want to give you my personal experience with Grunebaum. I have been offering since Grunebaum's first study
American obstetrician,
in New York, in American obstetrician in New York Hospital, and he only publishes Amos Grunebaum and Chervenak is an editor of American Journal of OBGYN. So it's a big surprise that they publish his garbage. But I have to tell you that since his first terrible study, which was very poor, I have been emailing him, because of course I have his email, all the time. And I say, debate me. I go to New York 3 times a year. Every time I write to him and I say, let's meet anywhere, in public, not in public, in front of medical students. I demand a debate. I would like a debate, even just in front of 4 doctors. Give me a debate. No answer, no answer, no answer, no answer, until I finally sent an email to him with all people like Christine McCourt and Kenneth Johnson and all the bigwigs and Judith Rooks, and I said, Grunebaum is a murderer. He's killing women. His C-section rate is 42%. 42%, and 1 in 3,000 of those women are dead. So finally, he wrote back, I just published a study. I lowered the C-section rate from 42% at New York Hospital to 35%.
But
he wasn't finished?
I think he was not finished. Very
No,
good.
but I'm really into her anecdotal story. I'd love to hear the end of it. Let her finish. I will say.
I continue to,
But because
Okay,
it's
yeah.
a press conference and I would like to...
give them a break.
Je to také tisková konference zde a protože bych chtěla dát možnost i vám, abyste se zeptali, tak ještě jestli má Zuzka něco základního, zásadního.
Zuzana, let me give one. So, in conclusion from what I said, when you look at the weight of epidemiologic evidence that is of high quality, there is no suggestion that home birth is any difference in risk than having, for low-risk women, any difference in risk than having a baby in hospital.
Děkuju. A Zuzka, přece jenom něco?
Přece jenom něco. Zrovna jsem se vrátila z poslanecké sněmovny a mluvila jsem tam s jednou moc sympatickou poslankyní a ona právě uznala, že zdravotnický výbor, který se věnuje těm zdravotnickým otázkám, tak je plný lékařů a ti mají určitou ideologii a ona sama to přiznala, jak kdyby šlo o náboženství. Takže tam nějaké studie nikoho moc zajímat nebudou, protože ona teda ještě řekla, že to náboženství je ještě jiného charakteru, protože když jdete do kostela, tak tam jste sice jako podřízen, ale kvůli tomu, abyste poznali něco vznešeného, kdežto když vlastně komunikujete s tím systémem, nebo když jste v nemocnici třeba, tak tam jste taky podřízen, ale jste zbaven vlastně lidské důstojnosti. Takže to jsem jenom chtěla zmínit.
To byla důležitá poznámka, protože víme všichni proč. Dobře. Děkuji panelistům za odpovědi na otázky, ale protože nám čas velice letí, já bych chtěla dát vám možnost, abyste se přihlásili se svou otázkou a máme tu mikrofon. Všichni musíte mluvit do mikrofonu, aby vás slyšeli tlumočníci a abychom mohli nahrát odpovědi ze všech stran. Takže má někdo nějakou otázku? Zajímá vás něco? Vzadu je úplně paní Mary.
The question is that the people who are against midwifery and home birth always invent something new to have it make very difficult. Can anyone inform me here, in your country, is it a practice that police comes at your doorstep and say that you are an ignorant parent to give birth at home and that you can be fined because you gave birth at home? Is that, I know this from Bulgaria, but are there any other countries that have this uncivil kind of behavior? None?
To byla otázka do auditoria, takže to je na vás, kdo tu sedíte ze všech zemí. Jestli je nějaká země, kde se dává pokuta?
No, ona chtěla na téhle zemi.
Ne. Mary, you meant in any country here.
Yes, in any country.
Jo,
I mean,
kterékoliv zemi, z lidí, kteří tady jsou.
Like, can I just comment something?
My name is Daniela Danic. I'm a Canadian expat and I live in Croatia. In Croatia, what sometimes happens is, even if a woman has a home birth, sometimes when it's not planned, there have been cases where women go to the hospital and say, can you look at my placenta or something like that, and they call the police. And in many cases, the police have come and said, oh yes, this is very nice, and they write something down and say, okay, we're going for a beer. But there have been, sorry, but there have been cases where child protection services have been called, and it often it often happens on a Friday or on a long weekend, during a holiday, because the people in the hospital know that there's nobody that the parents can call. So, you know, they put pressure on them for 3, 4, 5 days, trying to get them to say who their attendant was.
Viděla jsem tam a tady
I'm going to talk about this a little tomorrow anyway when I talk about Canada, but Canadians are situated in North America above, north of a very large, monstrous country called the United States of America. And it has always been very interesting to us, for us to watch what it was like in Canada prior to legislation compared to what it is like in the United States, even with legislation. And Canadians always consider themselves to be very polite. So our Royal Canadian Mounted Police would probably never come to a woman's home and knock on her door, because there's always been a feeling of respect for women, even prior to legislation and prior to us having legislation. Whereas when we were at ICM convention in Prague here just a few months ago, we're working very much right now with Hermina Klein, who is the lawyer working with human rights conferences. And we just received a confirmation from the United States that a young midwife and her mother, who is also a midwife, had the police arrive and dig up their backyard looking for dead babies. Wow. This would never happen in Canada. This is such an American thing. And so I would say from country to country it really varies, but in Canada that would not happen, even when we have no legislation.
Vzadu byla otázka. There was a question from the back.
Ešte k tomu ten mikrofón. Po slovensku nehovoriť, hej, dá sa? Tak na Slovensku sa to stalo, tiež zavolali políciu na matku, ktorá porodila doma, ale iba z toho dôvodu, aby išla do nemocnice na ošetrenie dieťaťa. Tá matka sa tomu podvolila, pretože nedalo sa ustúpiť a následne potom sa vrátila teda domov. Polícia teda nemá tieto právomoci, ale len to je fakt, že po ňu prišli, tak to spravila. Ale môže sa stať matkám, že na nich zavolajú psychiatra, alebo že na nich zavolajú sociálku. Takže to sa môže stať. Aj keď legálne to nie je oprávnené, stať sa to môže.
Tam se vzadu vlastně
Hello, my name is Zuzana Štromerová. I am from Bulgaria. I've never heard the police being called to mother's home because of a home birth. Now the police has been involved in 2 cases. One is where the baby has been stillborn, and the other case is where the hospital has some disputes with the parents because the parents refuse to pay. Normally, if there is no risk to the baby, if there is something wrong with the baby, they go to the hospital, and afterwards the police may intervene and check what was not done right, whether there was intent from the parents to hurt the baby. But normally, the people who intervene first, before the police, are the child protection services, and we have had several cases where the child protection services have arrived to parents' home after a home birth and insisted to check if everything was okay with the baby. The child protection services have been informed about the birth by either a doctor or a midwife, by a medical professional, when they either sought the medical help or sought to register the baby, as normally the law requires a medical professional, a doctor, to sign the initial document. It's not a birth certificate, it is an initial document before a birth certificate is issued. Now probably, Mary, you have more information than I have. Okay.
Judy wants something?
I'm almost 60 years old and I make no efforts to be politically correct. I have had many, at least 10 experiences where social workers were called, and I find that some women seem to provoke this, and some women, it seems to be a connection, and some women do the most outrageous things, and everybody turns a blind eye or isn't caught by them. And one comes to mind where she was endlessly harassed by social workers, according to her, she kept telling me, and I believed everything she said. And I must say that at this point in time, I have deleted her number. Like, she calls me and the phone call, I won't take her phone calls. So there, just, you know, stories about people digging up people's gardens are not always true. And sometimes people provoke things too.
Díky. Ještě nějaká otázka, komentář? Něco, co by vás ještě zajímalo a nedozvěděli jste se zde?
Dobrý den, já bych se chtěla zeptat, jestli v těch zemích, kde tady jsou zástupci, probíhají i plánovaně porody doma dětí, u kterých se ví, že vlastně prognóza po porodu bude fatální, že to miminko zemře. Případně už se rodí bez života.
Are there planned stillbirths? She asked whether there are planned stillbirths in your country.
Why not? What's the question?
If the baby is ill,
why not?
Will die.
The baby's dead.
Yeah, but then you have to go to the hospital after, right?
Why?
Well, you can't bury it. Just like
why not?
Když mluvíte bez mix, if you speak without microphone.
Yeah, I know. Both things.
In our study of home birth, there were a couple where they knew it was a stillbirth, and we also have experience in Ontario where women who have their baby has died, they've chosen to have a home birth. They were planning to have one. Why not?
England.
I wouldn't like to say without checking. I'm sorry, I don't like to project.
I just don't think that we have had any of those cases, but I can't see why a woman, if she had a strong risk and it was a stillbirth, or the baby had died, I can't see what the problem should be with that. We have never had any cases yet in Denmark where anybody has tried to raise the case that something should be done on behalf of the child. So I can't say what would happen if it was a seriously ill child. We never had any cases.
I delivered a stillbirth, and she buried the baby next to her grandfather, above her grandfather's grave.
In our case, a friend of ours had a baby who had serious congenital anomalies, I think it was anencephaly, and the baby had died. And the last thing she wanted was to have more trauma by going and having a hospital birth. She's always planned to have a home birth, and it was a natural thing to do.
Ale pravdou je, že tato otázka nám neřekne příliš nic o porodu doma a jeho bezpečí. Je to extrémní situace, ale podpořit tím bezpečí nebo diskuzi o bezpečí porodu doma nemůžeme. Já bych si dovolila shrnout všechny ty informace, které jsme získali, a aspoň mně z toho vyplývá to, že je důležité, aby stát přijal takový zákon, který říká, že porodní asistentka musí být u porodu, pokud jí o to žena požádá. To je základní. Jak k tomu právníci dospějí, to uvidíme. Dál mi z té debaty vyplývá, že je podstatné, aby měly velmi silné slovo ženy a aby se ozvali, že určitou věc, určitou službu chtějí. Pokud se ženy neozvou, tak vlastně ta služba není žádána a proč by měly existovat porodní asistentky, které chtějí chodit domů.
Ještě je jedna velmi oceňovaná kolegyně, Barbara Kostel, která říká, dokud ženy budou vyžadovat rodit doma, ale lépe řečeno, dokud bude jediná žena na světě, která odmítne odjet ze svého domova do nemocnice porodit dítě, pak musí existovat porodní asistentky, které jí přitom pomohou. A neslyšela jsem od nikoho z našich hostí, že by někde v nějaké zemi byl výzkum, který by řekl, porodní asistentka je nesmysl, jděte do nemocnice, tam je absolutní bezpečí. Všude slyšíme, riziko je srovnatelné, ale neslyšíme nikde výzkum o absolutním bezpečí nemocnice. To bych já řekla na závěr. Máte, tam se někdo hlasil, je to urgentní komentář?
Možná něco z té druhé strany, zase někoho nepřítele, toho zdravotníka, který s tím pak jede. Možná, kdyby byl prostor, aby to tady alespoň zaznělo.
Dobře, dostanu ten mikrofon.
Děkuji, já se ji teda představím jako ten nepřítel, ten zdravotník, který pak tam jede do té situace, kdy to dítě tam je. A řeknu jenom, že to je hrozně hezký, já chápu tady to vaše nadšení, ale pak, když jedete k plánovanému porodu doma, v panelovém domě, koncem pánevním do vany a zavolají vám, až už to dítě nelze zresuscitovat, to jsou chvíle, na které nezapomenete. A příběh, kdy matka teď již porozeného 3. dítěte, naše operátorky přijmou výzvu 3 hodiny po porodu, kde přijedete domů a tam je vykrvácená matka, resuscitace naprosto bez efektu a když pak zjistíte ten nález, co byl na pitvě, že důvodem úmrtí této matky bylo vykrvácení z ruptury hráze. Otázka je, jestli ty 3 děti, které teď nemají mámu, jestli to má smysl. Já samozřejmě chápu všechno toto nadšení, akorát je strašně těžký, když pak přijedete na to místo, kdy už tam většinou nikdo není, je tam ta nešťastná rodina a pak si zoufale volají tu záchranku a ono je strašně těžké pak v té situaci to zvrátit.
Já bych si dovolila reagovat a jenom krátkou otázkou, kolikrát jste toto zažila?
To jsou 2 případy z posledního roku, které jsme zažili v Jihomoravském kraji, bohužel ano.
Dobře, jistě by to sneslo ještě nějaký komentář a debatu, ale Zuzka z právnického hlediska by na to chtěla zareagovat.
May I say something to this? You know, you have to distinguish between system that works and system that do not work. So a question like this, if a woman bleeds from an episiotomy, I would consider that a failure in the system, because you know what we are talking about here when we are talking about research and home birth that are safe, it has to do with that you have to have a system of well-educated, well-respected midwives who work in a good relationship with obstetrical services if they are so needed. So I think really, if you have problems like this, you should look of, you know, how to make better cooperation between hospital services and primary care services, because I think you will find the link there. Because the way to make home birth safe, you know, you will never get rid of home birth. There will always be some women who give birth at home. So the question, actually we should change the question, not from is it safe, we should instead say, how do we make it safe so that women can have choice in home birth?
A právě k tomuto bude naše příští debata, která je zítra. Jakou podporu potřebuje bezpečný porod doma? Tuto debatu panelovou máme zítra.
So, you weren't at my topic, or at my talk, were you? This last question, were you at my talk? Because what I did for the last 5 years was talk to people like you, and get all the stories, and answer to each one. For example, wait, could you get off the phone, please? Oh, okay. Anyway, so let's take it. Oh, sorry. Women never die at home birth because there's always time. This woman didn't call an ambulance. I don't know why, but that's the. I don't know if she was suicidal or what, but the bleeding is slow, and even if it takes 1 or 2 hours to get to the hospital, she will not die from a vaginal birth, only from amniotic fluid embolism, and still she'll die in hospital. She'll be alive when she gets there, and if she doesn't call an ambulance. And from cesareans, you can die quickly from a cesarean because you need to lose many liters of blood quickly. So that's that story. And the breech, yeah, babies die from breech. That's why we don't do them at home. So I spent the last 5 years, and this is not at all an enemy. This is exactly what I was looking for all these years and talking to and getting the stories. What are these home birth dangers? And answering to each one. And I found that it's safer than hospital birth.
Já tím zakončím. To je takové pozitivní, takže děkuji všem panelistům. Ještě Urgy?
I just wanted to add something in response to the last person. Just again, it may be that you haven't looked at the large studies which show that poor outcomes can happen in any setting. So you, as Jette says, you have to look at the quality and the system of care. And this is why, you know, the big studies...
No, she was not listening since the beginning. She was talking to somebody else. Can you please start from the beginning?
Okay, right. Okay. Sorry, I just want to add to what Jette has said, really. It's very important when you're thinking about safety to look at the quality of the healthcare system, as Jette has explained, and to look at how things are safe or not safe. But it's also very important to look at the quality of the research and the scale of the research, because again, as Jette has explained, you can have poor outcomes in any system in any setting. So you need systematic research to make an assessment. And the important thing, I think, for a country like the Czech Republic is that the studies that show good safety are those where you have systems of cooperation, an organised system of transfer, clear responsibilities of midwives, good systems of training, sufficient midwives, cooperative relationships between different professionals. It's by no means perfect in England. We could do much, much better, but we have a basic system at least to encourage that. You have guidelines for practice, and I want to reinforce the point that Jette made, when you see women who are very high risk giving birth at home, it usually reflects a system that is not supporting dialogue and choice. So that the relationship between the woman and the healthcare system has broken down. That is a more dangerous situation, but that is produced by the way in which the care is organised. It's very important to understand that.
Děkuji.
In all of the home birth, in the studies that were done, presented in the WACS meta-analysis, there were over 350,000 planned home births. There was not one maternal mortality reported in any of those 12 studies.
Děkuji. Jsme živé, jsme radostné a unavené a potřebujete kávu. Takže vás zvu na přestávku a na kávu a děkuji. A zítřejší debata bude o tom, jakou podporu potřebuje porod doma zítra k večeru.